CLS Talks.
Talk to me.
CLS Talks.
Talk to me.
CLS Talks.
Talk to me.
CLS
Talk to
Talks.
me.
Real information.
Talk to me.
Real education.
Talk to me. Talk to me. They don't talk to me. They look like that morning. They don't talk to me. They bite that morning. They don't talk to me. They bite that morning. They don't talk to me. They bite that morning. They don't talk to me. They bite.
Hello everybody and welcome to our pilot episode of the CLS Talks. We're talking to you as the CLS and you can talk back to us in time as well. My name is Lionel Coveney and it's my great pleasure to welcome our very first guest, Des Carty of the Common Law Society. Des, how are you?
I'm great, thanks very much, Lionel.
Well, it's great to have you, Des, and I think we have a lot of interesting stuff that we will be talking about over not just the course of the next 40 minutes to an hour, but indeed over the coming weeks and months, hopefully, as well.
Absolutely.
But specifically today, the reason I wanted to pin you down was to talk about feudal tenure. This is something that I'm not overly familiar with, Des, and it's something that I've seen popping up a couple of times in my study and research over the last number of weeks. And I think it might be, call it a gut feeling or a hunch, but I think it might be something that will affect a lot of listeners out there. So, to start off on feudal tenure, what the hell is it? What are we going to be talking about here?
Okay, Lionel, I think you're probably a bit more familiar than you've led the listeners to believe with the term feudal tenure. So, to give the listeners a bit of a potted history about this, we've printed off some material and we're looking at it at the moment, and I'm going to read verbatim what it says in the dictionary in relation to what feudal tenure is described as or identified as.
Perfect.
Okay, so feudal tenure, system by which land was held by tenants from lords in England, UK, France and Ireland. The king was lord paramount and master of the realm. He granted lands to his lords, who granted lands to their vassals, and so on down to the occupied tenant. To the occupying tenant. Tenures were divided into free and unfree. Free tenure included tenure in chivalry, as in the case of knight service, socage, tenure by agricultural service fixed in amount and kind. The type of unfree tenancy was villeinage, a limited form of servitude. See also feudalism, fief, landlord and tenant manorialism. So in a nutshell, feudal tenure, if you're a feudal tenant, you're a serf or a slave, for another word.
Right, well, to me, Des, that sounds like we're talking about, knights are mentioned there, and this reminds me of secondary school history, where we're learning about medieval times and something that's as far removed from my life in 2014 as could be possible. So, in layman's terms, what is going on?
Okay, well, the reason we're discussing feudal tenure is because it's a hidden thing that is going on at the moment. And you would imagine, as you suggested, that in 2014 no such thing as feudal tenure or feudalism would exist. But factually speaking and legally speaking, it still is in existence. Now, going back, we'll say, to the year 2006, there was a man called Kevin Cahill. He's an academic by training and writing, and he wrote a book called Who Owns the World?
An interesting book, no doubt.
Yeah, and he went into the history of who actually owns the world. Now, from memory, he maintains about 80% of the world is owned by roughly 20% of the people. And he shows this information, obviously, in the book. Now, obviously, people need to check that themselves and they come back. Now, in terms of the statistics and numbers, we can be corrected on it, obviously, but I think roughly that's what we're talking about. 80% of the world, 60, 70, 80% is owned by about 20% of the people. So he wrote this in 2006. So, in 2006, it was recommended to the Law Reform Commission here on this island of Ireland, which is a body entirely composed of lawyers and barristers. They recommended to the Irish government of the day, I think it was Bertie Ahern's government, stroke the state of the day, that feudal tenure should be abolished in all its forms.
Okay, hang on a minute. So, right, to abolish something, it has to exist.
Correct.
So in 2006...
Yeah.
The Law Reform Commission in Ireland recommended that feudal tenure be abolished.
Correct.
So in 2006 it was there.
Correct.
This system of knights and serfs and what seems like a fairy tale in these so-called history books in secondary school.
Yeah.
How can that possibly be? It sounds to me like we're talking about slavery.
Well, it is a form of slavery. Look, as it suggested, feudal tenure means that the feuds, the serfs, the tenants, they do not own their land or property, territory, so on and so forth. They are owned by another body, in this case being the state. So in a nutshell, to sort of codify a word we've used before, round it all up, basically what happened was when the crown left the island, they literally handed over the law and the island to what we now know as the state.
Okay.
Okay. Now, that wouldn't be a bad thing necessarily, but what is happening is, what you see in 2014 is that you have this thing called austerity. So that would not be able to come about in such a way if the people of the island actually own the island, the property, the land. Because if the government of the day wanted to bring in austerity measures or austere measures, they'd actually have to go to the people if the people owned the island to take the money from them. So that would mean a referendum.
Yeah.
Which didn't happen. The government of the day made the decision, this is the right thing to do. And in essence, they have treated the people of the island as tenants, as slaves on the island, because they haven't looked to them for their view, their opinion, their vote, their agreement on such a thing. So therefore, legally speaking, now we're talking about legality of it, legally speaking, the people do not own the property, the land, the territories. Therefore, it's in law that the state own everything. And that's why they don't have referendums.
Well, that's absolutely incredible, because my understanding of it growing up was that we're protected by this great thing called the Constitution, and everything is enshrined in our Constitution, and if we want to change anything, or if the government or the state want to change anything, they have to go to us, the people. Now, as you mentioned, they didn't do it with regard to austerity or bailouts or the economic crash. So that should tell us something, and I think you have just crystallised exactly what it should tell us if we care to look at it in a rational way.
Well, you don't go to servants or slaves when you want to do something. The master decides. I mean, isn't that the simple, logical...
Absolutely.
If you have somebody working for you as a servant, stroke, slave, or as an employee for that matter, you tell them what's going on, what's going to happen, and that's it. It's black and white. And the way the state see it through the government, and I usually refer to the government as a puppet government, because they just change a government every once in a while, every 5 years or whatever it might be, and it's a new set of puppets in place, carrying out the legal orders of the state. So legally speaking, and people can better check this, to be honest with you, it's not a matter of me suggesting that they check it. This information is there, it's available to be checked. Now, if they wish to check it in terms of the legislation, acts, codes and statutes, they can refer to a thing called the Land Conveyancing Reform Act 2009, and I'll repeat that, and we'll repeat it again hopefully before we're finished. It's the Land Conveyancing Reform Act 2009. Now, without getting into the minutiae of what's in there, you have to put on your critical reading goggles to read it. So in 2006, as we suggested, the Land Conveyancing Reform Commission suggested or recommended to the state, to the government of the day, that feudal tenure should be abolished. Now, 3 years later, what happened was they brought in this act called the Land Conveyancing Reform Act 2009.
Okay, now before we get into that, Des, I just want to interject for a second, because I think it is worth clarifying what the state is at this point, because if anybody is to pick up a newspaper or look at TV or whatever it is, as most people do, the state to a lot of people is Brian O'Driscoll and the Irish rugby team, or it's the Irish soccer team, and it's the flag, and it's the glory, and it's sport, and it's river dance and culture and all this kind of thing. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a legal entity that is the state. So I just wanted to get that in there so that people could maybe make that distinction or separation in their minds. We're not talking about pride in the land that they live in. We're talking about an actual controlling entity with regard to the laws that exist, that are actually putting us in our, or keeping us in our serfdom, so to speak.
Now, the state themselves, just as a point of interest for people, and again, you can look this up, there is Supreme Court rulings on this going back to the 60s from memory, and the state are defined as what's called a legal juristic person.
Okay.
So they can be sued in their own right. So they are a corporation, as it says. They are a persona, and they can be sued in their own right as a persona. So that is enshrined in law again, where the Supreme Court have ruled that the state themselves are and can be sued as a juristic person.
Right.
So when you take on, if, say, for example, you had need to sue the DPP or the Garda Síochána or some minister, so on and so forth, you'd then be suing the state per se.
Okay, so nearly a form of limited liability for the individuals concerned.
Correct. Okay, so that again, you use the word codified, but that explains what the state are. They're a legal persona, and they can be sued and taken on as such. So they do operate and they do exist outside of the people of the island, and they do presume that the people of the island, the state this is, are actually feudal tenants on the land. They are there for the purpose of generating revenue for the state, which is what they do, in fact.
Yeah.
You know, that's what we're here for, isn't it?
So we're talking about a mechanism. We're not talking about Enda Kenny, for example, knowing everything there is to know about the law and deciding to shite from on high on the people. We're talking about him being a cog in this machine that is state.
Correct. I would imagine that when, I know we're kind of going off tangent a little bit here, but I'd imagine that when people like Enda Kenny or Michael Noonan, whoever it might be, it has perceived power in their positions they're in, they're told in no uncertain terms, this is how it works.
Yeah.
You do not go beyond this, because if you notice in the run into any election, they all make promises about we'll do this and we'll do that and we'll get rid of this and we'll bring in that. And then, of course, when they get into those positions, they change immediately. It's you would notice it overnight. If you were following a specific politician, you notice overnight when they get that position as TD or a minister, they actually do change, and they all of a sudden go very quiet, very reserved, very conservative. They don't commit to anything, and very often you'll find, as they have done in the recent years, it's noticeable that they have not actually followed through on anything whatsoever that they have promised.
And it is quite astonishing to see in action because it's so blatant.
It is nowadays, yeah. It's obvious to people, because I suppose what wakens people up is austerity. It is the hunger. You need to know what's going on.
Yeah.
But this is the backbone of the whole thing. It's feudal tenure explained, as we said, and we have an article out there on this. But if you just focus for the next couple of weeks or months, whatever it might be, on getting to grips with an understanding of this or knowledge of this, it would explain an awful lot of what's going on and why there is austerity. But this is not something that's all of a sudden come about. This has been intergenerational. You know, you can go back years and years and years to the foundation of the state,
Right.
where they have consistently hammered the people and treated them as tenants on the island. That's it.
Okay, so we're up to 2009 then, and the Land and Conveyancing Law Reform Act. What are we dealing with here? Because we've established now feudal tenure exists in 2009. It's been recommended in 2006 that it be abolished.
Yeah.
So what is this act and what happened?
Okay, so in 2009, it's a very far-reaching act. It covers property of all sorts and so on and so forth, as it sort of infers. So it covers primarily the conveyancing of, or the transfer of, land from one party to another, or property, or whatever it might be.
Right.
So in Part 2 specifically, they've actually buried in the acts. In any act, you'll find stuff that's buried. That it's buried for a specific reason. They do not want people to specifically know the consequences of the act. So within Part 2, the first couple of pages of Part 2, they talk about feudal tenure being abolished. Now, again, without getting into the minutiae of the detail, you need to have, I think you need to print off those pages of the act, alongside, you know, the information that we have, perhaps. Sit down and read it. Then go back the next day, sit down and read it again with a highlighter and a pen. Highlight the things you think are important, and then go back and read it again. And it will take maybe 4, 5, 6, maybe even 10 readings to really process the information. In essence, though, now I could read this. I'll actually read through some of the information that we have here. The essence was to, in the ideal world, to bring about a legal change within the law to facilitate the land and the properties of the island being transferred legally over to the ownership of the people.
Okay.
Okay, now you do get the implication there that that's what has happened within that act. But
Right.
if you read it critically again, it actually says, no, that is not what's happened. Now, what it reads is the reference in the Land and Conveyancing Law Reform Act is Part 2, Section 9. What it states is, from the commencement of this part, ownership of land comprises the estates and interest specified in this part. And then part 2 or section 2, it says, insofar as it survives, okay, insofar as it survives, we're talking about feudal tenure. It then says feudal tenure is abolished. So it's either abolished or it's not abolished.
Okay, right.
Okay.
This is head melting right now.
Okay.
It's not making sense.
So insofar as it survives, feudal tenure is abolished. Now, it's contradictory to start with. So they've either abolished feudal tenureship or they haven't.
Yeah.
So what they're saying is, on the front of it, it's abolished, but underlying that, it still survives. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Now, without getting into the minutiae again, now I won't get into the minutiae, but what it does say then is, and then it talks about other acts and statutes and codes underneath that, is that the state itself still retains ownership of the estates, lands, properties, territories of the island of Ireland.
So could we be dealing with the name being abolished, but the actual system being exactly the same? So if you're asked, has feudal tenure been abolished? Oh yes, it has. Here, look, it's been removed in 2009,
Yeah.
but the system is identical.
It's trying to infer that the idea and the practicality and the application of feudal tenure has gone. It's trying
Okay.
to suggest that. But the state are exempt from that. So the state still retain the legal title over the lands, territories, properties, so on and so forth of the island.
Amazing.
And what sort of brings that full circle then is that therefore it is delineated in law that the people then are treated, the people that happen to habitat or live on the island are treated then as a sort of a commercial facility in
Yeah.
which to generate revenue off their commercial property, which is the land and the property of the island. So therefore they are delineated now as still remaining as tenants, feudal serfs. Now, there's an event happened probably about 6 months ago. There's a group out there that go out and they challenge the validity of repossessions of property and land and so on and so forth. And there is a section in the first part of the Land and Conveyancing Reform Act 2009 that talks about what we call the sheriff. Now, there shouldn't really be a sheriff here if we have a republic or a sovereign republic, whichever way you want to look at it.
Yeah.
But the question at the time was whether or not the sheriff had the right to go to somebody's home, okay? Because, inverted commas, it's not commercial,
Right.
okay? And there was a challenge there by people saying, no, the sheriff has not got the right to go there because this is not a commercial property. But I would disagree with that in the context of this legislation.
Yeah.
Because if the state owns all the property and is treating all the property, all the land, all the territories as commercial, that defines then that the individuals that are living in the property on the land are then living in commercial property. And they're using it as commercial property because the state are deriving revenue from that commercial property.
Yeah, so it's all about the context then and the framework that exists, and we're really into it here. I mean, this is the framework for that.
Correct.
Which is not common knowledge, hence people think that, okay, well, let's look at the Constitution and the home is inviolable or whatever.
Yeah.
When actually that's not the case because we have it here in front of us.
Correct. They've as again we've used that word, they've put it down, they've codified it and said, well, actually this is actually the reality behind the whole thing.
Yeah.
The perception is different. Perception is different, and the government, the state, so to speak, they don't mind too much if the people, go out and they protest, they march, they walk around, which I've no disagreement with either. But you see, it doesn't really educate the people at a fundamental level whereby people critically think, right, there's something seriously wrong here. We know there is something wrong. That's why we're out marching and protesting and disagreeing and so on and so forth. But they're not bringing the right questions to the government, to the state. From my perspective, this is my view, would be that people need to start, if they're going to speak to the likes of politicians, so on and so forth, and the government, they need to start saying, well, actually, what's the story? What's the real story here? Do we own the island or don't we?
Yeah.
Now, real serious reform has to happen, which I don't see happening just yet. I don't think there's enough people on the island educated well enough just yet. Maybe it'll happen in 6 weeks, 6 years, whatever it might be. I suppose that's part of my remit of the work I'm doing.
Yeah.
If people get educated well enough about this, they can actually make change happen. It will require a fundamental dissolution of the state, because the only thing the state are holding on to is the fact that they legally still own the island.
Okay.
if the people own the island, that would make that would render the government helpless in terms of bringing in austerity and continue to tax people in the way they do. They'd have to go to the people every time, like they did per se in Iceland.
Yeah.
They'd have to go and say, well, look, we want to bring in this austerity measure, or we want to bail out this bank next. And naturally, people would say, well, actually, why would we bail out or pay taxes in terms of austerity to private corporations when they should have failed?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, it doesn't make... Now, this actually, by reading this actually helps you sort of put a framework in place. As you say, contextualizes everything. This is why they're able to do it, and this is why they did it. They did not need to go to the people. They had the legislation to be able to go forward, bail the banks out, and continue with their austerity.
Well, that really has brought clarity to it for me, because I was always fascinated by the perceived arrogance of those in supposed power, and how they could railroad through people who would wave the Constitution in their faces or wave this law, that law, the other law. But what I was lacking was that context or that framework to actually be able to address the issues from there. Without that, you have nothing, and you're essentially not able to see the wood for the trees. But that's what this feudal tenure explained is doing for me now personally, and I think can do for anybody who cares to look at it in any kind of depth.
Well, again, the actual act itself is very difficult to read and decipher, but I'd say to people, look, obviously read the article we have there. It's available at the Common Law Society website, and then take out the act and go through the act. Now, it is a huge body of work, to be honest with you. Now, from memory, I think it's about 100 pages plus, so it will take you a bit of time to get through, but I think it's well worth educating yourself. Now, it's not just a matter of you educating yourself per se just for the sake of educating yourself. I think you should be educating yourself in order to be able to pass the information on to your own people, to your children, to educate them as well.
Yeah.
Because if things don't change, they will continue. It's that simple.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and it isn't going to get any better. It'll keep going in the same cycle it has done since the formation of the state, and the continuation, in my view, it was just a continuation of the crown the state is. You know?
Yeah, and it brings us to that whole Hegelian dialectic, the problem, reaction, solution. A problem is engineered, the people react, and then go to the very people who have engineered that problem for their solution. Nothing can possibly change within that paradigm, and that's the paradigm that we have in the mainstream right now, and that is what needs to change, as you say. So then, with regard to feudal tenure, we know it exists. We know that we've had the wool pulled over our eyes. We have a wolf in sheep's clothing there. What can be done, or what should be done beyond education? I mean, I'm certainly of the opinion, Des, that any power that politicians have or that anybody has can only be the power that we grant them. We're the ones with the power, and they rely on us through their covert methods or the language that they use or whatever it is for that power.
Well, there's a sort of micro level and a macro level. On the larger macro level, I think what has to happen is ultimately the state have to be dissolved. You know, they have to be legally dissolved in terms of their ownership of the island, and that means possibly a referendum whereby everything is put on the table. People are said, are told, look, do you want total ownership of this, of the land, the territories, the property of the island? And I think most people would say yes.
I think so, yeah.
Because it puts it into their private control then as a people. We own the island. You know, it is our island. Therefore, it reduces the power of the government stroke state then to make decisions that the people do not agree with.
Yeah.
So that'd be a macro way to look at it. Now, the second part of the macro way to look at it would be that there's one thing that it's a kind of it's not a strange one. You'd fully grasp this. Most people wouldn't. But I think that we need to dissolve also the Central Bank of Ireland. We need to have our own currency that we trade in, to facilitate trade and exchange. And people are usually saying, well, how will we trade with Europe? How will we trade with England? And so on and so forth. There certainly would be a lot of change to have to be made, you know, in the short term. But I'd see the short term of doing something like having our own currency that is controlled for the people, by the people. A medium term thing as a transition that we could, I'm not talking about going back to the punt now, but I think we need an independent currency
Presumably usury free.
Yeah, usury free, as in there's no interest being charged.
Yeah.
You're not being charged interest upon interest, so forth, which eventually expires the money anyway.
Yeah.
So it's we need a form of money stroke exchange rate, so that we can intertrade within the with the people of the island. It will take a few years to take off. Whether or not people have enough confidence to do that, I don't know yet. I don't see it just yet. It's probably something, as I say, on a macro level we need to really consider. And I don't think the European Central Bank would be too happy with us if we did that.
I can't imagine so.
Not that I care too much, to be blunt with you, because I don't think it could be any worse than what's been experienced now. And they have planned for it to get worse. So, it is going to get worse. I think if going back, say, 2007-8, whenever the bailout happened, if they'd have just said right there and then, okay, well, we'll take it on the head, we'll let the banks fail. They had, at the time, from my best knowledge, at the time, had planned to bring back the punt.
Okay.
At that time. So we would have gotten over that hump, and we would have been well over it by now, and things would not be the way they are now. We're still giving billions and billions and billions over in austerity measures, taxes. We still have billions in funds to return, apparently, to the European Central Bank. And we're finding more and more now that the Central Bank of Ireland are determining the fiscal policy of the banks on the island.
Yeah.
So we should have taken the step, retrospectively speaking, and let the banks fail at the time. But I think at the time also you had too many politicians, as you have now. They just bought into this game, and they were told this is the way you do things.
Yeah.
And that's it. Some of that may have been through ignorance, but I can't say it is, because I'd be pretty confident that most politicians at a senior level would know about this. And they have a duty of care anyway, be it in their offices, to know this stuff, know where this is coming from. So I know people say this all the time, but politicians they are liars. It's that simple. They do lie. What's that old joke? How do you know if a politician is lying? They're moving their mouths.
Yeah.
So there is fundamental change now on a micro level. In my view, I think that people need to again critically read this sort of material with other material. And in my view, if you don't have the money to pay something, you shouldn't pay it to start with. But then I think critically you should look at the law and ask yourself the question, well, do I have to pay it?
Yes.
And
that's fundamental to it, because if I walked up to you on the street, Des, and said, look, I've just decided now that you have to give me a tenner.
I'd probably give it to you, John.
Well, maybe you would, because I'm a very imposing, intimidating guy. But if I was 5'2" as opposed to 5'4", and I said the same thing, you may not be so amenable to my requests.
Correct.
Now, if somebody is coming looking for whatever it might be, a water charge, a tax, whatever it is, I think I have a duty to myself to look at why they want this, and, as you said, are they entitled to it? Because if they're not entitled to it, as I wouldn't be entitled to your tenner on the street, by God, I'm not giving it to them.
Well, that's it. But again, it's at a micro level, people, even the smaller things in life, people fear. Like, parking a car, you have to pay for a ticket. People do it, and I have to say I do it myself generally, just to avoid the hassle of the traffic warden. Now, again, if I didn't have it, I wouldn't. It's not because to be honest with you, generally my principle would be I usually have a couple of bob, not always an awful lot in my pocket, but my principle is I'm keeping that money. And I'm damned if I'm going to let any stranger, as you suggested, walk up to me on the street, or for that matter write me a letter or send me something in the post to say you owe us this money when I don't, but they haven't given me anything for that money. So it boils down to fundamentally, if somebody is prepared to give you something and you're prepared to take it, and you're prepared to exchange something fairly for that, that's fair enough. It's a fair exchange, no robbery. But for somebody to ring you up or write to you or infer that you owe them money simply because you drove down a road, or you exist for that matter, or you drank some water, or because you watch television, that you owe somebody money for that thing, or because whatever. That is, to me, it's actually an anathema to my brain. I can't grasp that,
Likewise, it reminds me a little bit of the protection rackets that were run the 1920s in America and in the north of Ireland much more recently, where you had criminal groups offering protection in a sense. In other words, we won't punitively damage you in some way if you give us money. In other words, we're going to give you nothing, bar the fact that we're not going to threaten you if you pay us. How is there a distinction or a difference in what the state are doing with the new charges that they implement? Because it doesn't wash with me. And I think I'm a rational enough person. It doesn't wash with me to say, oh, well, the Troika demand this or Europe demands this. I don't care. I don't have a relationship with the Troika or Europe. So if you decide through the post to impose a new charge on me, show me where the consideration is. Show me what I'm getting in exchange for that. And maybe then I'll have a think about it. But until you do, there's nothing for me to think about.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
What else is happening in the world of CLS and the Common Law Society? Because coming into 2015, there are some exciting times, and I mean genuinely exciting, because you have a number of bits and pieces on the way that can really help empower people. So what's happening, Des?
We're doing a couple of books at the moment. We're devising, obviously, a few courses for the new year. We're excited about a book we're doing with a guy called Aidan Killian at the moment as well.
Yeah.
And there's one or two other books pending
that
we're awaiting drafts for. And also, alongside with yourself, Lionel, we're going to be doing a radio show in the new year. Now, we won't fix a date specifically just yet, but I'd imagine maybe March, February, March, something like that. We'll be broadcasting a brand new show, and we've set provisionally on a title called CLS Talks. And that is primarily going to be talking to people like ourselves, you know, the average man in the street, common people.
Yeah.
Whereby we'll talk to them about what they've done, what they're doing in relation to the law, how they can go about doing things, so on and so forth. And obviously we'll go off on different tangents in relation to stuff that's related to that. And we're hopefully in the new year going to push that out there and educate thousands and thousands more people.
Well, fingers crossed. And I think the beauty of it, Des, is the fact that you or me, we're no different to Johnny or Mary out there who might be listening now and would never have heard of the Common Law Society before. Nobody is legally trained in the conventional sense. Everybody's self-educated. Everybody is self-empowered. There's a bit of unlearning to be done before the real learning can happen, but anybody can do this. It just takes a lot of hard work, yes, but it's a journey that anybody can start tomorrow. In the morning, it just go online, start looking at some of the things that we've been speaking about, start figuring it out in the context that you've been given, this new paradigm for a minute, break down those barriers and those walls and start to actually see it in action. Because I remember when I first started to examine some of this information at a very localized level, I was astonished at how the veil had been pulled over my eyes for whatever length of time, all my life, and how I had been tricked, and very, very cleverly tricked. And it is empowering information that everybody should and can have access to, and I think can is the important word there. We're no different to anybody else listening, and in a month's time it could be Johnny or Mary who are in here talking to us about what they've uncovered and what they've discovered and how that can help everybody else out there as well. I think there needs to be a kind of a fostering of a sense of community nearly, and we will be trying to facilitate that through the radio show with interaction, etc., because that's where we really get our collective or our macro power, as you mentioned earlier on. If we initially work at the micro level and concentrate on our own personal responsibilities, well, if there are enough of us doing it, we reach a tipping point where it becomes an unstoppable force.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't disagree with anything you've said there, Lionel.
Well, Des, it's been a huge pleasure chatting to you. Give us the website so people can maybe get in touch or find out a little bit more.
In the first instance, if obviously we'll be announcing whatever is coming up in the future, but if people go to thecommonlawsociety.com, that's www.thecommonlawsociety.com, and if they put in a name and an email address there, we send out usually a weekly email or a mail shot to people who are on the list, and we'll be announcing, as I said, we'll be working on books and schools, and now a radio show in the new year. So we'll let people know in plenty of time what's happening.
Fantastic. Well, I'm very much looking forward to 2015 and the changes that hopefully will be in the offing then. So it's been great chatting to you, Des, and I look forward to our next chat.
Grand, thanks, Lionel. Bye.
The CLS Talks.